Good afternoon and welcome. I am Jim Parenti, Dean of the University of Minnesota College of Liberal Arts, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this afternoon to a special event, a very special event in the life of this university, a lecture by Nobel laureate Thomas Sargent, former faculty member of our college, and the conferral of an honorary doctorate of science on this distinguished scholar. I especially welcome the many faculty, alumni, students, and friends, including several from out of town, who have braved the latest Alberta Clipper to join us here today. An honorary degree is the highest award conferred by the university. Specifically, a Doctor of Science degree honors, quote, contributions to knowledge, knowledge being the core value and contribution to society of a great university. The University of Minnesota honorary doctors comprise a most distinguished club. They include artists like Maya Angelou, Merce Cunningham, Tony Kushner, and Frank Gehry, scientists like Jane Goodall, Earl Bakken, Norman Borlaug, and leaders like Warren Burger, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Desmond Tutu, and the 14th Dalai Lama. So Tom, if you want to meet me after the ceremony, I will give you the complete list of names so that when you meet any of your fellow honorary degree holders in New York who are still around, you'll know how to greet them with the secret handshake. The College of Liberal Arts takes special pride in nominating Tom Sargent for this honor, for he is one of our own. Tom was a faculty member in our Department of Economics at the time he and his colleague, Christopher Sims, were conducting the research for which they won the 2011 Nobel Prize in Economic Science. Although Tom's immersion in his field is deep, his thinking is broad, encompassing many areas of knowledge. Like many great economists, Tom reads widely in several fields outside of his own. Economics, after all, developed as part of moral philosophy in the 18th century. Adam Smith was a professor for a time of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. And his major work, The Wealth of Nations, is an erudite encyclopedic compendium of the history of humankind in commerce. And as reported yesterday in the New York Times, if anyone is skeptical about the relationship between morality and economic activity, just ask any Icelandic banker, or I should say, ex-banker. Tom, too, is a great lover of history, I know, and those great questions that trouble historians about the growth, governance, and demise of nations and peoples are veritable gold mines for economists wrestling with today's most vexing problems. I emphasize this last point because Tom's career exemplifies that the liberal arts, of which economics is a part, produce so many leaders, people who understand their fields deeply, yet know how to make their work relevant and meaningful in a larger social and humanistic context. Tom, you're not only an outstanding scholar and one of the most cited economists in the world, but also an outstanding exemplar of liberal arts leadership, a Renaissance man, a uomo universale, as the Florentine humanist bankers used to say. You are one of the world's leading intellectuals, and we are enormously proud of you. Congratulations on receiving the honorary degree, Doctors of Science from the University of Minnesota today. That ceremony will commence in just a few moments after Tom's lecture, but let me now turn the floor over to Professor Chris Phelan, Chair of the Minnesota Department of Economics, who will introduce our guest of honor. Chris?
Thank you, Dean Parenti. I'm Chris Phelan, and it's my honor to be the current chair of the Department of Economics, so I get to be the one who gets to introduce Tom Sargent. In thinking about what to say, and understanding that this is the presentation of a Minnesota honorary doctorate, I actually thought it would be fitting if the Michigan fight song were played for some time. Why? Because it's Hail to the Victor. Because while I think it is fair to brag, and we do brag, and say Tom Sargent is still at heart a Minnesota economist, it is also accurate to say that we are all Sargentians now. Here at Minnesota and throughout the world, Tom and his contemporaries at Minnesota and Chicago and Carnegie, but we won't talk about that, took over the world. How they argued economics, and especially macroeconomics, should be done is basically how economics is done everywhere now. There is still a distinct brand, Minnesota economics, which we are quite proud of and promote through organizations such as the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute, which Tom generously serves on the board of. But the difference between how things are done here and how things are done at other top places is smaller than it used to be because of Tom's work. He's convinced the world to be more like Minnesota. Tom has done this not only one paper at a time, but also one person at a time. Just like his collection of outstanding papers is amazing both in numbers and quality, his collection of outstanding students is equally amazing, also both in numbers and quality. I'm not one of those students. But I've had a glimpse of how he does it. I first met Tom Sargent when he gave a talk at Chicago when I was a graduate student, and instead of going out with the faculty for dinner, which is what's usually done, Tom asked to go out with a group of students, and I was lucky enough to be invited. I have trouble remembering my own kids' names at times, but I still remember that conversation from 2 decades ago. Ideas are just incredibly important to Tom, and his enthusiasm about them is infectious. This kind of story is typical of what scores of others would also say about Tom. I've always joked that if Tom has a long layover at an airport, he starts a graduate student reading group. He's the Pied Piper, and we're all lucky to be following him. He has convinced us with his papers and approved our own papers with his time. It is with great pride and genuine affection I'm honored to give you Thomas Sargent.
What do I do? Thank you. Okay. I love Minnesota, the university, and I love the Department of Economics. So this means a lot to me. I predate slides, so I'm not comfortable with this. Actually, okay. Actually, so at Minnesota, my idea, it wasn't my idea alone, of being a good teacher was getting up and on the blackboard and doing a lot of erasing and making lots of mistakes. And somehow the students in Minnesota are so great, they would make up for your mistakes and do good work despite us. That's the sense in which I'll accept that I was a good teacher. And Ellen knows that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about currency unions, sort of. And actually, I'm going to talk about the euro, sort of. So there's a famous painting by René Magritte called, it's called This Is Not a Pipe, and it's an image of what appears to me to be a pipe. So my talk is not going to be about the euro. Okay, so this year and last year, and I fear next year, there's going to be some questions, some fundamental questions. And I'm going to do this, I'm not going to have any equations, but there's going to be one equation in my head in the background. So these are two, I'd say they're superficial questions. I'll tell you why. One question is, should a country join a currency union? And I'll tell you what a currency union. You see this stuff? It's a collection of countries somehow agreed to use the same currency. That's what a currency union is. And I have to tell you what somehow is. So I don't know if you know, the United States, several countries are on a currency union with the United States. And I'll bet neither candidate Romney nor President Obama knows the countries that are on a currency union with. They're Ecuador, Panama, and Zimbabwe. I'm not even sure all the members of the Federal Reserve know that. Okay. Okay, so now the reason I mention those, the United States doesn't really care whether those countries are in a currency union with us. Maybe it doesn't know and doesn't care. And there's no obligation of the United States government to support the government bonds of those countries. If you buy a Zimbabwe government bond, it'll be denominated in dollars, and there might be a risk premium relative. Because President Obama doesn't even know about it. So okay, so that's it. So I'm going to tell you, at the beginning of our country, by which I mean in 1776, when we declared independence from Great Britain, we joined a currency union. So if you look at our initial debt, we issued there were 13 independent states. They were sovereign states, and there was a central government called the Continental Congress. They all issued debt. Those debts were denominated in dollars. That was the Spanish dollar. It's a Spanish silver coin. Spain probably, they didn't care, and they weren't going to bail us out. So these debts, as I'll tell you later, went at deep discounts, sometimes. That's the story. So we were on a currency union. Okay, so there's going to be two questions. But there's other kind of currency unions, too, which I'll tell you about. So this slide's a bluff, because I haven't told you completely what a currency union, what it means to join. So we'll talk about that. So there's going to be two questions for 2013. One that's talked a lot about. Well, should a country join a currency union? And should a country exit a currency union? So Minnesota style, those are superficial questions. So the deeper questions, and almost everything I know about this I've learned from people who are now faculty members at Minnesota. So first question is, should a government pay its debts? That's the first question. And I'm going to proceed in the unromantic fashion of an economist. I'm going to do costs and benefits. That's one, economists say that's one approach to talking about getting married or getting divorced. Okay, so then the second question is, in a federal system or a confederal system, like we have in the United States, or Argentina or Brazil, should a central government pay debts incurred by subordinate governments? Those are my two questions. And these are as old as the hills, and you're 25. Someone's going to be asking these questions when you're my age. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the questions. Should a country pay its debts? Well, I'm going to give you a reason not to pay, really good reason not to pay. It's costly. In order to pay your debt, you've got to raise taxes. You have to, relative to your ordinary expenditures and your ordinary transfers, you have to raise taxes to pay debt holders. And you already got everything you want from them because they gave you resources 10 or 15 years ago. So you're not going to get anything more from them. And taxes are costly for various reasons. They're hard to impose, and they're hard to impose for good reasons because they impose distortions on the economy. Not just in reducing incomes, but in clouding the signals that a price system gives. They harm incentives. Some harm incentives more than others, and great work at the Minnesota Economics Department has been, by faculty and students, have been how to efficiently tax. But no matter how efficiently taxed, they're costly, so default. So what's the reason to pay? You might want to borrow again. And paying existing debts fosters good reputation among prospective creditors. So reputation is a tricky, if you think about, especially if you're not an economist, you know a lot about reputation. So a reputation is, and actually if you're an economist, you should know more. But you've actually thought a lot about it. Well, what a reputation, my reputation, I'm I'm in imperfect control of my reputation, because my reputation isn't my property. It's yours. It's what you think about me. It's your expectations about what I'm going to do in the future. So how does this come to be? It involves at least two, and usually many people, to form a reputation. So this second bullet point is somehow, if I default on my debts and I'm a country, that's going to damage my reputation for paying in the future. If I'm sure I never want to borrow again, it's a good thing to do because I'm not going to have to tax. But if I ever might want to borrow again, I might want to think about repaying. That's the deal. So should a country pay its debts? There's reasons to do it and there's reasons not to do it. Okay. Should a central government bail out subordinate debt governments? Actually, one thing I learned at Minnesota is don't call it governments and subordinate governments, call it X and Y. And then there's lots of X's and there's lots of Y's. I could say, should the Fed, nothing personal here, bail out big U.S. banks? Okay, so here's a reason not to bail out. It's what we call moral hazard. And by the way, if anybody tells you economists didn't foresee the financial crisis, especially macroeconomists, especially Minnesota macroeconomists, and that proves that Minnesota macro is bad and wrong, it's just dead wrong. It just means they didn't read. So I'm going to tell you two things to read. A 1978 paper by Carrican and Wallace that talks about what will happen because of moral hazard reasons if you deregulate banks and you leave lender of last resort policies as they were and deposit insurance policies as they were. What they show is banks, if you do that, banks will have, and you deregulate, banks will have an incentive to become as big as possible and as risky as possible, and you will get big bank failures at government cost and collateral damage with probability 1. You can't predict when, and physicists can't predict when either. That's what quantum mechanics is all about. But it'll happen, probability 1. And then there's a 2004 book by Gary Stern called Too Big to Fail, and just read that book. It's a Federal Reserve Bank of Minnesota employee wrote that. Gary Stern. So reason not to bail out a central government to bail out subordinate governments is bailing out subordinate governments subsidizes their profligacy and creates incentives for them to want subsequent bailouts. You got that? Or do you want me to tell you about my brother? Okay. So, and I'm not talking about Europe. Okay, so now here's reasons to bail out. There's reasons to bail out. Quid pro quo. In exchange for paying debts of subordinate governments, constitutions are restructured to give the central government more control over the activities of subordinate governments. So you bail them out, but you take control of them. And the reason you want to is to handle moral hazard. And maybe you want to take over them for other reasons. Okay. So I welcome questions. Okay, so now we come to currency union. There's distinct reasons. So these are the central questions. Currency unions are a detail, and in some ways they're a sideshow. So here's two good reasons to join a currency union, and they're very different. And this is all a spin on what. There's two senses of currency union here. Currency unions mean different things here. So here's the first reason to join. By joining, so think of Italy. Joining foreign governments, think of Germany, impose discipline that forces your government to balance its budget in a present value sense. So by joining a currency union, you're going to have to change your fiscal behavior So the way I'm going to say that is Italy is forced to behave more like Germany. That's the deal. So when the euro was set up, what it signaled was Italy, which had a weak currency, chronic deficits, big inflation, badly regulated financial system. That's their big risk premium on their bonds. When they joined, it meant they're going to reform internally. That's what it meant. That's one story. So here's the other reason. Very different kind of currency union. So that's like a U.S. currency union with Spain in the 1770s. Second reason is by joining, your government expects foreign governments to finance part of your government's domestic expenditures. This is really different. Your government has access to much bigger taxes now, taxes from abroad. So here's why I'm going to say this. This is nothing personal about anybody from any particular country, and I just chose Italy and Germany by chance. So here the idea is Italians expect German taxpayers to help fund Italian government expenditures and debts. That's the deal. That's the deal. So now this is a different kind of currency union. It's like, it's somehow, it's going to be some kind of fiscal union, not just a monetary union, where tax and expenditures are going to be somehow transferred across borders in ways that support what were weaker countries. And now notice, the Italians are just helping the Germans to be more like Germans. Pay more taxes, work harder. And it's a great deal. It's a great deal because then the Italians get to still be like Italians. That's the deal here. Okay. So now the question is, let's just do a little modern history. So you could say, okay, so we're sitting in the 1990s. And you could ask, we're sitting in the, say, 1995 when the euro is under consideration. And you could ask the following question. Okay, there's a proposal for, again, nothing personal, for some country that has a weak currency in the 1990s, poor labor market regulations, social safety net that is excessively generous, people don't work very hard. You think of your favorite countries. And they are going to join, the proposal is they're going to form a currency union with Germany, and Germany is going to support them fiscally. Okay, so you ask this. Do you think in the mid-1990s, knowing those situations, that Germany would ever, you could ever expect Germany to want to join a union like that? Just think. So put yourself in that situation. And the answer is, if you know history, yeah. Because in 1990, Germany did that. And it's interesting to see how they did it. So how did they do it? In 1990, there was West Germany and there was East Germany. And East Germany was a basket case. East Germany was a country with a very weak currency. There's a black market, high repressed inflation, very low work ethic. People hadn't worked since very bad incentives. You know, a state didn't use price signals, all those things. Currency, there's a black market. The official rate, I think, was 1-to-1, German and East German markets. The black market rate is 7-to-1. So what happened was Germany, West Germany bailed them out completely. And what about the debts? If you were holding East German marks in 1989, you made a bundle because West Germany converted them 1-for-1, giving a capital gain to every East German citizen, and speculators like some of you wish you were. And what was the deal? Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Germany, East Germany ends its constitution. There's completely obliterate East Germany's laws. Talk about a fiscal union, social safety net union. West Germany takes over. That's the quid pro quo. That's the deal. So now if you're kind of thinking in the mid-90s, well, how does this go? You know, what kind of currency union is going to be? The big thing is, anyway, that's the deal. So you might have thought they would join a currency union. Now here's a good reason, oh, this brings me to this, a good reason not to join a currency union, after I just told you that scary story. Or is it scary? Was the story about East and West Germany scary? Well, it depends on who you were in East Germany and who you were in West Germany. The West Germans are going to pay a hell of a lot of taxes and do some other things. But some of the taxes, okay. East Germany, if you work for the Stasi, it's a bad deal. You know, if you were in East Germany, so there's winners and losers within the country. Okay, so distinct reasons not to join a currency union. To avoid discipline foreign governments may want to impose on your government's taxes and expenditures. Okay. So you can already see from this constellation of costs and benefits that economists and prominent central bankers get asked the question: what should Europe do about its currency union, and so on? And should it do this? Should Greece leave or join? And then, my advice to anybody asking those questions is don't answer them, because these are complicated things, and there's winners and losers, and there's no should. There's should for Sargent, but that's probably something should not for you, because there's distributions of these are highly distributional questions. Okay, 2 reasons to exit a currency union. See, we're almost done. So a fiscally profligate country may want to leave to avoid other governments' threats to impose discipline and control. Spain, Italy. A fiscally prudent government may want to avoid having to bail out and or impose unpleasant discipline on other countries now within the currency union. You read the news, and Italians and the Germans are getting blamed for lots of stuff. I mean, they're not okay. It's not pleasant. They're in a situation where they're asked either to bail out or to impose discipline. Either pay taxes or be bad cops. And just, politicians like Berlusconi say, they say things, nationalistic things anyway, so that's it. So the question is, so who chooses? Fortunately, not economists. Okay, diverse groups of voters with conflicting interests within each country decide, you know this, and within each country there's winners and losers. Okay, so there's going to be, now I'm going to tell you about the one equation here. It's a government budget constraint. So you already know what that is. So you know what the family budget constraint is? Actually, some of my friends in the, okay, it's okay. So every period you have a family budget constraint, and then I can see somebody saying, I don't have one, because I can always just borrow. Well, okay, great. The fact that you can borrow means, next period you also have a budget constraint, you can borrow more. So these are all linked together, and if you link them together, this gives rise to it's called a differential equation, where the government debt is either growing or shrinking depending on what the government deficit is. Okay, so a macroeconomist from Minnesota sees a differential equation, and he wants to solve it. Okay, now it turns out there's 2 ways to solve it: backwards or forwards. So if you solve it backwards, what it tells you is government debt is big today if you spent a lot more than you taxed in the past. It's basically a moving average of your past expenditures minus taxes. And if that number was positive a lot, your debt went north. Okay. Now, if you solve it forward, it says your government debt today can be big only if the present value, the future stream of your taxes is bigger than your expenditures. It's got to be bigger than your expenditures, because otherwise nobody's going to hold your bonds. So big debt today signifies big deficits in the past and big surpluses in the future. So think about that. If you're young, like you. This is what my generation did to you. You just think about that. We've given you a big B, a big government debt, and we had big G relative to T in the past, and you are looking forward. You're going to have big T relative to G. Thank you. Okay. So what this is going to be? So this is an equation. This is an ideology. This is arithmetic. So that's the one equation which everybody has to agree about. So what a fiscal crisis is? What a fiscal crisis is promises have been made to people who are recipients of government expenditures or entitlements or transfers, people who pay taxes, and bondholders that don't seem to fit together. That's what a fiscal crisis is. Somebody thinks things don't fit together. Now promises have been made. Okay. Now, the government budget constraint says, so you should call me on this. See, that's a bluff because it has to fit together. The government budget constraint is a constraint. So it's got to fit together. So something has to give. So what it means is some of these promises aren't credible. They can't be believed, as the CBO tells us. So what happens is, but there have been promises. They're on the books. So that's the situation in the United States today. But what you learn is when promises aren't, all the promises can't be kept, some of them got to be broken. So one thing that I learned from reading history, I don't mean to be histrionic about this, but fiscal crises sometimes, actually often, produce political revolutions. So I'm going to tell you what I mean by I'm going to tell you what I mean by a revolution. I mean a change in constitution. So now I'm going to tell you what I mean by a constitution. Okay, so what I mean is a game. Okay, so I'll tell you what an economist means by a game. It's a list of people. So that sounds like a country or a continent, so it's a list of people. It's a list of all the things that they can do, all the actions that they can take. Economists call them strategies. So it's a list of all the things everybody can do. Then what's a list of is we call them payoffs of everybody, every person, as a function of what everybody else does, including themselves. Sounds pretty general. So it's like how happy you are about all the actions you're taking and everybody else is doing. And then finally, it's a description of who chooses what when. It's an order of moves as information flows in. And then we supplement this with a description of the world which is putting information in the system as time evolves. That's what we mean by game. And then economists have one equilibrium concept. It's like everybody in sight is, so a great economist from Minnesota, Andreo Mascale, PhD from Minnesota, says everybody in sight is a greedy, lying little bastard. Meaning they're all doing the best that they can, given what everybody else is doing. So an equilibrium is a situation where, given those rules of the game, a description of who chooses what when, everybody's doing the best that they can. And that's what I mean. Game theorists calls that equilibrium. I'm going to call it constitution. So in the United States, we have a constitution. We've actually had two, which is something I'm going to come back to. It includes what you call the U.S. Constitution and all the rules by which Congress is administered, all the things of federalism, all the things by which in Minnesota, all those rules, the way it all stitched together. And when you see an equilibrium, it's a robust thing because of this equilibrium concept. Everybody's doing the best that they can, meaning given what everybody else does, I don't have any incentive to change my behavior. So an equilibrium or a constitution an equilibrium under a constitution is a really hard thing to change. That's the message I want you to get from that. And I read that as I see historians having a lot of trouble explaining revolutions, because what a revolution is a change in a constitution. And you know, like if you're an economist, you go to a game theory or micro or a macro class, teacher will put on there a certain game. You'll be analyzing the game. You'll spend all your time computing an equilibrium, talking about the game, and you'll get kicked out of class if somebody asks, why don't we analyze another game? Because that's revolutionary. Okay. Okay, so here's what I want to talk about. Fiscal crises often produce political revolutions because some promises have to be made. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story. I've told you all this. Told you this. Okay, I'm going to tell you, again, not talking about Europe, I'm going to talk about the U.S. And this will take me, I'm almost done. So this is a macroeconomist reading U.S. history. Okay, so anytime you read history, there's a zillion facts, so I'm organizing the facts. So I'm doing either pattern recognition or pattern imposition. So that's a warning. Okay, so I'll tell you about the U.S. Okay, the U.S., great paper by Chris Phelan and a colleague, Tax Riots. U.S. began with a tax riot. We had a revolution against Great Britain because we didn't like the big taxes. We have 13 independent states, New York, Massachusetts. There are 13 sovereign states, and they write constitutions in 1776 and 1777. They don't like big taxes, and they don't like the British Crown. They organized the United States of America, and they put on a Continental Congress. And within a few years, they write something called the Articles of Confederation. It is our first constitution. Okay, I don't have much time. I have to tell you, Articles of Confederation are Ronald Reagan's dream. And I told you what a constitution is. It's a description of who chooses what when, and a list of what they can choose. So that's what I mean. So this constitution is designed to produce a government that can't tax, spend, or borrow, a central government. And how did they design it? Despite the fact that they're fighting a war. And when you fight a war, you need some resources. I'll come back to that. So how did they do that? The individual states are fiscally sovereign, the 13 states. The central government has no ability to tax. It can ask the states, which are sovereign states, for contributions, and they can say no. The central government has no ability to regulate foreign trade. There are 13 foreign trade policies. And a foreign government might be a foreign state, or it might be England or France. It might be New York. If you're Virginia, it might be New York. So it's a very weak confederation. Here's the consequence of this. During the war, and how we finance the war is really interesting. We do it with a combination of 14 governments print money, and the money rapidly depreciates. All 14 monies rapidly depreciate. The central government and the individual governments issue government bonds. They're denominated in Spanish dollars for the most account. About 12% of them are sold abroad eventually. 100 minus 12% is bought domestically. Much of it is bought at the point of a gun. That's how we finance the war. At the end of the war, we win in 1781 or 83, depending on how you count. I mean the United States. There's some people here from Canada. Okay, so when we win, if you computed the debt GDP ratio of the U.S. government debt plus the state debt evaluated at par, it would be about 40%. But this is a really poor country, and it can't tax enough to fund that. So what happens is the U.S. government debt in the 1780s goes at deep discount, like 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. And the state debts are going at deep discount. Okay, so what happens is, and you can read in the works of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, they're members of Congress. They want to honor the debt. So they try to get the central government to get revenues from the states. And they do all sorts of things. They try to amend the Constitution and so on. But I told you, this was Ronald Reagan's dream. This is a Constitution that's designed to produce outcomes where the central government can't borrow, tax, and spend. Why can't it borrow? Because it can't tax. So these guys were happy to default on the debt. So the question is, now ask yourself this question, was there a fiscal crisis in the United States in the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation? And a moment's thought, you'll say, well, it depends on who you were. If you're a creditor of the U.S. government, you might say there's a fiscal crisis. If you're a taxpayer, you say this is working like a charm. Okay, so, and it's an equilibrium. If you don't believe that the power of this definition of a Nash equilibrium or competitive equilibrium is strong, read about it. Smart guys, you could say, oh, if only James Madison could bargain smarter in Congress, or if only we had a smarter central bank. We sort of had a central bank. If that guy was only smarter, it didn't matter. This Constitution is working. So Leo Hurwicz talked about mechanism design. This was, these guys knew mechanism design. Okay, so guess what happened? So there's a book, Charles Beard wrote about this, and I think he overdid it, but there's a big grain of truth in it. Basically what happened is in 1788, 1787, there's a political revolution, and we wrote a second constitution, and it was illegal the way we wrote it, just cutting through the things. These people were sworn to support the U.S. Constitution, which is the Articles of Confederation, and amend it in certain ways. They violated all that. They met behind closed doors. They swore to secrecy that they would never tell anybody what they said behind those closed doors. They said there was a meeting of a bunch of prominent people, George Washington, James Madison, for the purposes of discussing ways of improving the Articles of Confederation. And the first thing they did was rip up the Articles of Confederation. And they wrote a new Constitution. And from a macroeconomist point of view, they did two key things in that Constitution and in the first acts of Congress. The first thing they did was, there was one tax in those days which raised big revenues. Remember, this is a very poor country, and it's the tariff. And there were 13 tariffs. They took those 13 tariffs and they said to the individual states they're illegal. The federal government now has a monopoly on the right to issue the tariff. It had no taxes before. It now has a monopoly on the single tax that raises revenue. And then the second thing they did, they didn't do this at the Constitution, but it was understood that they were going to do it, is the federal government completely bailed out all of the states. That's the first thing that Congress did. Completely bailed them out. It assumed 100% of the debt. And why did they do that? Well, so Alexander Hamilton, who I know he's in the kindred spirit of Leo Hurwicz. So what he said was, he's 33 years old. He's Secretary of Treasury. He's learned his economics at night while he's serving as Chief of Staff of George Washington. He reads about 6 books. We know what they were. And he thought hard about them. So here's what he said, is the reason that we are, first he says two things. Why are we going to pay why do we want to pay the debt? He answers that. He says, we want to pay the debt because we want to get a reputation for paying it. And we might want to borrow again. He says, why might we want to borrow again? Well, God forbid, there might be a war. And then another reason is, God grant, there may be some opportunity that we have to make purchase some public good, like 10 years later, Louisiana, where we didn't have the money to buy it. But by 1803, because of things Hamilton and George Washington did, we had earned good credit. So you might want to borrow again. And then why are you bailing out and this is Hurwicz. This is Hurwicz, Jones, Chari. This is mechanism design. He says, why do you want to bail out these states? And he says, it's a big deal. It is a deal. We want to bail out the states because Now we've got the power to tax, but this isn't a dictatorship. There's going to be a Congress, and it's going to vote the taxes. And what we want to do is we want to make the creditors, the former creditors of the states, become advocates of people in Congress who are going to vote high taxes to service all the government debt, which is now going to be consolidated. We want them to vote a high tariff, and we want to transfer the interest of the moneyed interests from the states to the federal government. And they pull it off. They restructure the government debt in a way that they do it in a very interesting way. By the way, they do it in a way that implements some of the ideas of Bryant and Wallace, another great Minnesota economist. They do a little bit of discrimination. So that's what they do. Okay, so now I'm going to close with the following thing, because it's just getting started. Reputation. Notice what, and there's some papers about this that Chari taught me about. Reputation, and remember, reputations. So what the federal government bailed out the states, that was part of a political arrangement to service our debt, to create a new equilibrium, to service our debt. So, okay, so the way the U.S. government, what Washington and Hamilton understood, this is the punchline, they understood that if you want to service the United States government debt and raise it to par, which it did, it went from deep discount to almost par, you got to change the Constitution. You have to change the Constitution so you get a democracy to vote the taxes that are going to service the debt. And they did it. And they did it, but if you go read, they did it by the skin of their teeth. If you actually go and read the state ratification conventions, it almost didn't pass. They used every trick in the book to pass it. So there were lots of losers. So they did that. Now notice the following. They created a good reputation for the United States vis-a-vis its creditors, while simultaneously creating a reputation vis-a-vis the states that they were going to bail them out. Okay, so fast forward. It's a long story. It's a long story, and by the way, you have to read the 11th Amendment to the Constitution. That's never taught in school because it's sleazy. What it says is if you have a claim against a state government, so the U.S. Constitution says that state governments have to pay their debts. It's in the U.S. Constitution. The 11th Amendment says if you want to enforce a debt against a state government and you're a foreigner, you got to do it in a state court. You can't do it in a federal court. Guess what? You can't enforce, a British person can't enforce a debt against Alabama. Okay, so here's what happens. In the 1820s and 1830s, the state governments, and this is going to tell you another version of fiscal crises often produce political revolutions. And I told you what a political revolution is. You rewrite the Constitution. So do you know that today many state governments have balanced budget requirements in their state constitutions? Why are they there? They weren't there in the beginning. They were there because of something I'm going to tell you about. So in the 1820s and the 1830s, there were no such requirements. State governments ran big budget deficits. They used them to finance railroads and canals. And the deal was these canals and railroads were going to bring in lots of state revenues, and the bonds were going to be self-financing. There was infrastructure. So they issued a huge amount of debt. And then in the 1830s, 1837, there's a financial crisis, and a large number of these debts go into technical default. Big parts of these debts were purchased in Great Britain. Why? Well, the U.S. had a reputation for paying its debt. And by the way, the U.S. had bailed out the states before, so this is the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, so they assumed, because they hadn't read the 11th Amendment. So what happens in the 1840s, early 1840s, these state debts go into default, and the states, together with British creditors, go to the Congress and they say, this is American as apple pie. You were born in a big bailout. Bail us out again. And this time Congress said no. And so and you kind of ask, why did they say no? Moral hazard. They gave a different answer the second time than the first. It's interesting to follow up why. It had huge consequences, and you could ask, was it a good idea that they didn't bail them out? And so you could say, if they did bail them out, what do you think the consequence of that would be? So they didn't bail them out, they walked away, and one consequence is that state after state, more than half the states at that time, rewrote their constitutions to put in year-by-year balanced budget requirements at the state level. The states did that themselves. The federal government didn't force them. If the federal government had bailed them out, it would have been probably a fateful day for federalism in the United States, because the federal government probably would have assumed a lot more control. There would have been a quid pro quo, a different quid pro quo from last time. So, I don't have any time to talk about Europe.
Tom, you gotta go sit there because there might be some questions. Not so fast, Tom. We still have time, about 5-10 minutes, for our questions from the audience. So, there's a question there.
Will the solution to pay off the $88 trillion debt, not the $16 trillion debt that we have, be to exploit natural gas for export and have means testing for Medicare people on their operations in the future, and also have a change for people under 50, but take care of the people that are over 50. 3 things.
Well, this is for the United States?
Yes.
Well, I could tell you what's going to happen in the United States.
Please.
Taxes are going to go up on everybody, on everybody, or entitlements are going to go down for a whole bunch of people, or the government's going to default on some debts, especially since some other people from other countries don't, or we're going to have lots of inflation. And so some combination of those things I can confidently predict is going to happen.
All right, so fess up, Tom. Let me ask a question. We're waiting for our people. So I know you cleverly tried to avoid talking about Europe, but are we talking about 1788, or are we talking about 1841 when it comes to Europe?
Okay, so I heard, so people say different things behind closed doors in Europe than they do out in front. So I heard Gerhard Schroeder pretty openly call for a United States of Europe. So he wants 1789, and he wants it for a reason. And he speaks as a German. So you have to think of 20th century German history, European history, where twice, or at least once, maybe as the first time, there was a German project to have the United States of Europe. You know what I'm talking about? World War II. And there was the United States of Europe with big transfers. You know, France and Italy paid a lot. Anyway, so that was a project, and it was a project brought on by warriors, aggressive people. And the project that Gerhard Schroeder has is the opposite project. It's a project of German people that are peaceful Germans who don't trust other Germans, and French people that don't trust other French people, and they want to destroy national identity and create they want people to be Europeans and not Germans, and they're willing to they want to give up national sovereignty for that. It's the same. It's a version of the project that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton had. They wanted people to think they were from the United States and not from Virginia. And Gerhard Schroeder knows the government budget constraint. And he knows about labor market reforms, by the way. So he's very open about it. So that's the project. Now, how you get there? Like Washington and Madison, they just have a convention and meet behind closed doors, and there's no damn television. We're just going to do this. And now it's a messy project prospect. It's improvisation. You try to. So okay, Minnesota macro. Here's the kinds of things that we know how to analyze. We know how to analyze coherent, well understood, even if they're complicated, strategies that governments and corporations play, and how those work out and how they adjust. If things are ambiguous, vague, not spelled out, incomplete, not fit together, conflicting announcements. Like if you read about the policy in the euro and euro regulation, and you go underneath, it's not coherent. Some of the things people at various institutions, I'll just give you an example, the ECB announced, they're not feasible unless some other people do a bunch of other things that may be illegal for the other people to do now. So it doesn't fit together. So if you ask us how that's going to work out, we have to make, the answer is we don't know, and what we don't know about is, we don't even know what the current arrangement is, because it's so messy.
In other words, it's just like being asked on television, do you know which way interest rates are going to go? Is that?
Actually, you know what one of my friends who's a Minnesota graduate said, a very distinguished Minnesota graduate? He said, that was a terrible answer. You should have said, under the risk-neutral measure, every yields are martingales.
Well, what we'll do now is... No, but that requires rational expectations. Too much to swallow. What we will do now is we're coming close to the conferral ceremony, so those of us who have to change will do so behind the curtain. Pause, and then...
Wait, Chari. What about the halftime show yesterday?
Given my obvious resemblance to Beyonce, the reason Tom says that is because Tim Kehoe likes to joke that I have only one name, it's Chari. And so he says that's exactly like Cher or Madonna or Beyonce. And so we'll retire, we'll change, and then come back, and then Dean Parenti will introduce President Kaler. Need one round of applause.